Good good morning, everyone. It's lovely to have everyone joining the event today. It's the SFMI um, introduction and launch of the 2026 program. We've still got people joining us, so I'll wait a minute or so before starting. But we do have quite a lot to get through today, so I'll commence in about a minute's time. Okay. We've still got a few more people coming in, but I'll make a start. So we've got a lot to get through today. So welcome. This is the SFMI Sustainable Facilities Management Index. We're going to be talking about the industry trends, the tools and the road ahead, and launching the 2026 program. Um, so as mentioned, um, quick introduction for Sophie and myself as well is going to be presenting today. I'll talk about the industry updates and some of the key challenges that are taking place together with a couple of the major regulatory changes. And then Sophie will take us through the 2026 program and also the self-assessment tool, which we've recently launched. We're trialing at the minute. And then I'll close by talking around looking ahead to 2030 and a recent report that we've published, looking at the ambitions for the FM sector and how sustainability is incorporated as part of that. There is a Q&A element in here as well, so please do send questions through. As mentioned, that'll be myself, Sunil. I'm the Managing Director of Cloud Advisory and also the SFMI. And I'll be joined by Sophie, who is the SFMI Program Manager. And as I mentioned, we do have the Q&A function available. So if you do have any questions, please do ask as we go throughout. Okay. So if I start off just a quick overview for those who don't know the SFMI. So we've been running since 2013. The focus that we have is to look targeted and very much focused towards the FM sector. And how do we provide that forward roadmap for the sector itself? So it's for the industry as a whole and collective, and we engage with outside bodies, but we also work with the FM industry itself, outsourced providers, as well as organizations themselves to benchmark their own performance and to provide the next steps for them to be able to progress as well. So the wider SFMI assessments that we run has been implementing that program now for the last 12 years, very much in line with industry standards requirements and at the leading edge. Okay, so if I take you through the industry update and some of the key changes which have been taking place. From a wider perspective, there's been an awful lot of geopolitics that have been changing how we operate and influencing the way that business decisions are starting to take place. Over the last 6 to 12 months, we've certainly seen the general consensus around climate and ESG breaking down. And that's not something new, but it has accelerated. And we have got to a point now, I think, where organizations and countries are comfortable with having multi-speed level activities taking place. So there will be countries out there and there will be organizations out there who are comfortable to not progress with ESG measures, to not progress with some of the climate risk and adaptation measures as well taking place. But vice versa, there will be organizations and countries who see that very firmly as a critical part of what they do and how they operate. So we now are operating in a landscape where organizations, countries have multi-speed levels that are taking place, and an understanding of how they operate and how they link together becomes important for how we then start to communicate and engage with each other. So that may also start to influence things such as procurement activities, because we need to understand how an organization is operating, and therefore does that align with cultures and strategies. The Iran war and also the recent weather events that we've had have really put into focus some of the challenges that we've got around items that we have very little control over. So the price hike that we're starting to see in fuel is likely to lead to inflationary pressures as we go mid-year and later on this year. And that's going to increase the price of pretty much everything that we're going to be involved in delivering. So that's adding on some new risks, which we need to start to assess and understand for the delivery of our own programs, but also the pricing associated with that as well. And those weather events as well is starting to change how we start to look at resilience and transition planning. So from an organizational perspective, the language has changed a lot, moving away from talking around climate in its own right, much more now starting to talk about resilience and the resilience of an organization to deal with some of these big impacts, and how you then transition towards a system model which is better able to cope. We do, however, on a bright side, have a consensus around the ESG regulations. So the new ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the reporting, two key reporting they call S1 and S2. So that's a sustainability reporting and a climate risk reporting, has now been adopted largely throughout the world. There is a direct linkage now between the ISSB and also the European CSRD. And those two now are seen to be working hand in hand, but are also now adopted pretty much across the entire world. So we now have a single approach for how we're looking at sustainability. It's a climate first approach that we are taking, but it now allows us to have a view about where the future is going and the monitoring, the modeling, the reporting that's going to take place. That should give us confidence. It should allow us to also invest for what those future requirements and outcomes are going to be. However, we do also have those budget freezes taking place because of the geopolitical tensions. And that's raising the question about how we look at AI and the use of AI to be able to support. So from a sustainability perspective, we've used data hugely over the past few years to understand how buildings are operating, the concepts of smart buildings. What that allows us to do, though, the use of AI, is to be able to understand the huge amounts of data that we do have, and to be able to get insights and be able to make decisions from it. And that's something that we've not necessarily been able to capture beforehand. But a criticality part of that is about how do we ensure that we ask the right questions so that the data, the AI, can feed us how the changes can benefit us and benefit the buildings and the FM service provision. So in terms of the implications for the sector, I've mentioned some of these already. So certainly the operational risks is increasing and the need to be able to understand these as part of risk registers, enterprise risk strategies becomes more pronounced. So what we're looking at is how do organizations start to have these conversations at middle level and senior levels within businesses so that we can understand the trade-offs that might be necessary. There's certainly going to need to be an understanding of different models of how we deliver services as well. With the changes that are starting to take place, inflation pressures as well that's starting to come through, what does that look like in terms of FM service model delivery, the pricing constraints that we do have as well? And a counterbalance and a counterpoint to that will be that use of AI. But we've also got to have that open conversation about what does it mean in terms of data, who owns the information, the data as well. And that part of it is still lagging a long way behind the opportunities that we use in AI for. And finally, what does the sector overall need to do? Upskilling is paramount here. A lot of these items that are starting to come through are coming through thick and fast. They're requiring decisions to be made relatively quickly, and those decisions are going to have knock-on influences and impacts. So a lot of this is how do we upskill, particularly the senior level teams, to understand trade-offs and knock-on effects, and to be able to then manage and mitigate against those. Building in resilience criteria into the financial systems is also a key one. So how do we have that twin approach? We need to better understand financial criteria and the finance ways of working, but in a similar way, the financial system needs to accommodate for how we build these non-financial risks in and how we can accommodate them within the financial reporting systems. And then finally, a lot of this also looks at how we're going to understand changes in the way that services are being offered and the general focus of moving away from a cost element, which has been happening for some time. But we still have frameworks and large frameworks out there, which is very much a cost reduction, a run to ruin type approach, which is still being promoted. And that's something which, from a sectoral perspective, we do need to push against, because that doesn't lead to a positive outcome in terms of a service provision. And in terms of some of the major changes which are starting to come through, the new 14,001 standard came out a couple of weeks ago. It's got to be implemented, we believe, in the next 3 years. And it's an add-on and an extension. So it's not a dramatic shift on what currently is in place for the 14,001 system, but it is a gentle uplift in the requirements. And it takes us much more in line with the new standards which are coming out. So some of the key elements, we want to ensure that certain elements like climate change, pollution, etc., are absolutely 100% included as part of risk evaluations. They don't have to come out as significant risks, but they do need to be evaluated. And I think one of the major changes that has come about is the move to make top management explicitly and personally accountable. So the ability to delegate, which has been there beforehand, has been removed, and it's much more about the accountability of the top management. That means, again, they need to better understand what's happening, but also they have to be available for the meetings that are taking place and for the audits that are occurring as well. The other aspect of this is a much stronger life cycle perspective. So from an outsourced provision perspective, the outsourced activities firmly come into scope of the 14,001 standard. The roles, activities, the environmental impacts, therefore, are key parts of that. And the other major change to the regulatory landscape is the UK SRS. So it's the UK Sustainability Reporting Standard. And we provided in the recent newsletter an article which takes you through a lot of the changes which come through related to the SRS. Key part of this is that from a UK perspective, FM construction is seen as a material risk. We've had the recent collapses of Carillion and ISG, which exposed a significant financial impact upon UK PLC in general. And that's posed a much greater profile on tier one providers. And so that high profile places the FM sector as, whilst not directly in line with the UK SRS, will become a key contributor as a tier one provider. So what I would encourage is organizations to start to look at what does the SRS mean for you. Again, it may not be a direct involvement, but as a tier one provider, an involvement as part of a supply chain to an organization that is responsible, comes under the SRS, will put you in scope for large parts of it. So what does that look like for the business? How do you understand what data looks like, ownership and the basic controls? What does coordination look like within the business and the general understanding of the subject area, and help to build up that literacy of the language, two ways, financial language and non-financial language across the various groups. So those are the stepping stones that can be taking place over the next few months. The regulations likely to come into place early part of 2027, and first financial year reportings into 2028, which, whilst it sounds a long time away, you're talking the cycles here typically of 2 to 3 years to be able to develop and understand information that's going to go out into the public domain and to be assessed by investors and the public in general. Okay, so that was a quick overview in terms of the landscape of some of the key changes which were taking place. Both of these two elements were fed into the criteria as well for the SFMI to 2026. And to talk through a bit more about the programme, I'll hand over to Sophie.
Thanks, Sunil. So yeah, I'll be covering the 2026 programme. But before we get into it, just wanted to briefly look at the context that the FM sector is operating in. And we thought the best way to do this was by running through the key challenges that the sector is facing. So the first key challenge is around pressure to evidence how sustainability can create measurable value for clients, tenants, and investors. So it's about going beyond just cost and compliance. The second is around expectations increasing faster than internal capacity. So sustainability is rarely the core role of FM leaders, but expectations continue to increase alongside day-to-day operational pressures. Then we've got fragmented data and unclear sustainability narratives. Environment, social, and operational data is often siloed, which makes it difficult to track progress and also communicate a coherent sustainability story. We've also found that there is a lot of generic tick box assessments that don't necessarily actually drive impact. They rely on, many organizations rely on tools that lack sector relevance or credibility. And the main output is just producing reports rather than actually driving meaningful change and business benefits. And then rising client and investor and procurement expectations. This is rising very quickly and often are inconsistent. So this context is why the SFMI exists and why we've evolved the programme, the way the programme is structured. So the SFMI is designed to directly respond to these challenges. And so we've highlighted here the kind of value that the SFMI creates. So firstly, this is around turning sustainability into credible evidence, independent sector-specific framework used in bids, tenders, and external communication. SFMI also provides clarity on where to focus efforts. So we've got structured audits and benchmarking across 22 ESG topics, which identify gaps, priorities, and practical next steps, moving beyond the generic tick box tools. The SFMI is also designed for FM operational reality. It's built specifically for facilities and property management, reflecting how services are delivered, contracts are procured, and performance is measured. And then moving from insight to action, assessment outcomes are translated into improvement plans supporting decarbonisation, social value, and well-being in practice. And then the last big value that we create is through collaboration. SFMI brings FM providers and in-house teams together to share experiences and drive sector-wide improvement. So the reason why the SFMI has this reach, this perspective, is based upon the depth of our industry engagement and knowledge. This is demonstrated by 100% of our partners that have been surveyed using the SFMI outputs in client bids, tenders, or external communications, and 100% of our partners recommending SFMI membership to others. Currently, we have around 20% of the market of the FM market engaged with the SFMI, and we're also a member of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which just demonstrates that our engagement is across the industry, and that it goes beyond certification alone, including self-assessment, working groups, and leadership forums. So the key pillars of the SFMI, this highlights that SFMI is a year-round program, not a one-off audit. We split this into 4 pillars, and these are around assessments, awareness, community, and strategic support. The SFMI is designed to support organizations as expectations mature and maturity evolves. So we've broken this down into a bit more detail on this slide, on what exactly this looks like. So one of the main important key feedback that we had was on the importance of collaboration and community. So we wanted to really build on this year. We've added the SFMI working group, which is a regular group for member organizations to share insights on the challenges and to focus SFMI efforts where it adds most value. We also have leaders forums, which are exclusive roundtables, discussions with partners, industry bodies, and topic experts. And then we also offer additional learning opportunities and knowledge sharing. So that's around the quarterly newsletter we share, the SFMI Hub, which is for partners and members, and that has access to all knowledge, learning information, and then on additional industry research and articles and reports. So the SFMI solutions demonstrates that we are now positioned around maturity rather than organization size. So I think previously it's easy to be under the impression that a large organization is always audit ready. But we found that that's not necessarily the case. You can be a large organization and not necessarily be mature, but you can also be a smaller organization and progress very quickly. So we've kind of broken this down into a maturity-led framework. So the certified assessment is broken down into assured and premium partner. And that is where you have a full audit, and that would be for organizations that are at the higher end of maturity. But for those that don't feel ready yet or are less mature, we've got 3 options on the self-assessment tool, which I'll go into more detail in the next slide. But these are also split into, again, maturity. So we've got light, which will give you a quick insight into current position. Then we've got core, which will allow you to interpret results, identify priorities, and drive improvement. And then Insight Plus is scaling up as the maturity increases as well. On top of that, we also have SFMI membership, And with SFI membership, you also get access to the working group and the learning materials I mentioned previously. So with the hub, articles, the newsletter. So essentially, this proves that SFMI is accessible, flexible, and progressive, and we can support organizations at every stage, not just the finishing line. So moving on to the self-assessment tool, just wanted to provide a bit more detail on what that looks like, as that is new this year. So sustainability is now a requirement, as we know, but many FM teams struggle to turn ambition into an actionable plan. The purpose of the tool is to address limited time, specialist resource, and in-house expertise, and to provide a quick, credible view of ESG maturity across FM-specific E, S, and G criteria. This isn't just an assessment for assessment's sake, it's about enabling confident decisions and what the pathway looks like after doing the assessment. So the key outcomes are instant ESG insight, provided a trusted FM-specific baseline, confident decisions around having results informing roadmaps and planning, fast practical action, being able to focus effort without full audit complexity, and internal understanding, and a shared view of ESG maturity across teams. So just wanted to give you a quick overview of what the steps are for completing the assessment. The first step is around completing the assessment. The assessment itself will probably take you under an hour, maybe an hour. It's 40 questions, and there is clear guidance provided for each question. Then, once you've completed the assessment, you are given instant actionable insights. So you get an automatic score and an interactive dashboard that will showcase your results, and that will highlight the strengths, gaps, and priorities immediately. In step 3, depending on the level that you choose, so light, core, or insight, you will get report and expert support from us. So that will be a summary of strengths and gaps and tailored feedback sessions or workshops where selected. So across all scopes, all steps, the questions remain the same. What changes is the depth of and what organizations actually want to get out of it. So as I mentioned earlier, in terms of if you just want quick to know where you are, or if you want help on how you implement that in your organization going forwards. And then we just wanted to show you what the dashboard looked like. So this is the sample analysis. So gives you an idea of your executive summary of overall ESG maturity, a breakdown across each of the 3 key themes, highlights where gaps exist and points are being lost, and also links directly to explanations and recommendations. This will give organizations a shared reference point for teams and will then support internal alignment, and also enables informed discussions with leadership, clients, and procurement. And then, creates a baseline that you can use year on year and building it year on year. So, the self-assessment tool provides clarity, confidence, and direction, and integrates seamlessly into the wider SFMI program. Then I'll pass back over to you, Sunil.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much, Sophie. So what I want to run through for this last piece here is looking at 2030, the ambitions report that was pulled together, but also starting to pull on some strands that Safe has spoken about in terms of the SFMI assessment and also the online tool itself as well, and how we can make sense of some of these changing landscape requirements as well. So if I can hopefully get control, otherwise, Sophie, I might need to ask you to move to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So we produced a report, so it was launched a few weeks ago. There's a link on the page to be able to scan and to download the reports. This was a build up on the report that we produced in 2020. And the report here is looking at what does the sector look like it towards 2030, but also what's the lessons learned that's come through from the last 5 years as well. So we're focused upon four key material issues that's affecting the sector: decarbonisation, well-being, social value, and also looking at the risk and opportunities. So that came out from a materiality study that we performed towards the end of 2024. And it was a viewpoint that says, what is it that the sector can do to really start to influence changes within the UK overall? So when we look at decarbonisation, that's very much taken in the vein of how do we help UK achieve its net zero targets by 2050? And the FM sector's got a key part of that within the building sector, but also some of the supporting activities that take place. In the same way, well-being has a direct connectivity towards productivity, and how do we enable individuals to become more productive, to become more comfortable within their workplaces, and that should enable organizations to become more productive. So our viewpoint is very much focused towards things like sickness levels and productivity. And same with social value. How do we connect out to an increasing number of individuals that feel disadvantaged, disenfranchised within the current model and the current systems that we have, and provide them with the route back into employment and provide them with those opportunities to be able to develop. And again, the FM sector is probably one of the few sectors that we have that allows individuals to be able to thrive and to be able to develop themselves within the operations of the business. And then finally, looking at those risks and opportunities, that's very much in connection to the areas that I spoke about beforehand, looking at changes, geopolitical risks, climate risks, etc. But the opportunities that are also there as well in terms of service model delivery, in terms of the use of technologies, and about how do we change the way that the FM provision is provided, but also how we communicate that information out towards business, and how that manifests itself within even things like organizations' financial reports as well. So the report itself takes us through a view of looking at some of those changes, but moving ourselves towards those headline goals that we're trying to. Okay, next slide, please. So looking at each of the areas, we focused upon the Gartner hype cycle as a structure around how the industry is responding against each of these four areas. And so the hype cycle itself takes us through from initial peak of inflated expectations. The world will be solved by the development of a single tool and a single activity. Trough of disillusionment, as we understand that not everything can be resolved, but also it helps us to prove the tools and systems themselves as well, get a better understanding of how they operate, and also start to look at what's the meaningful response that we can get. And that takes us into that slope of enlightenment and also into the plateau of activity. Both of those two, which is about mainstreaming the concepts and the ideas into day-to-day life. And what we're looking at is getting towards that plateau productivity where a mainstreaming's taken us towards the 40 to 50% of the sector is starting to adopt services. And we use that sort of language and we use those criteria. It's a recent survey that was done, which talks around 30% of the FM sector believes that they have embedded sustainability into their operations, either wholly or in part as well. So from a sectoral perspective overall, we're only at that trough of disillusionment and slope of enlightenment overall from a sustainability perspective, let alone for some of these individual areas. Next slide, please. So looking at decarbonisation and where we are. So the 2020, 25 and 2030 timelines are noted on the graph. We were in 2020 at the peak of inflated expectations. That's when we had the COP26 taking place in Glasgow. We had hundreds of organisations making net zero commitments and statements. Many of those organisations put in a figure of 2025 to get towards net zero. We've climbed down and got a much better understanding of where we are. And currently, we're climbing ourselves out of the trough of disillusionment. So we understand the subject. We also understand that it's not simple and easy. Whilst we can control some elements, there's many areas that we can't control, we can influence, but those changes will take time to appear. And so by 2030, what we're starting to see is some key changes taking place where projects will be part of roadmaps. Where we have outsourced provisions, those outsourced activities will form part of their clients' roadmaps overall, and therefore will have a much greater ownership and relationship between the service provider and the client in the delivery a lot of these initiatives and activities as well. So overall, whilst it will be customer driven, I think that means there will be challenges that will be ripped out, and it's for the sector to be able to respond. And when I say customer driven, it's not just from the estates provision, but it will also be from client sustainability teams and also the client senior management, maybe even going into the in-house provisions as well. The FM sector needs to be able to respond about how they can understand the challenge, but also how they can move it forwards. We're also believing that service level emissions will become normalized. We'll start to see it an awful lot more within organizations, trust within the information as well. So therefore, we need to also be talking about what do we understand by validation of that data. But it will also start to be used as decision making and a driver for those decisions. Taking on organizations which have a demonstrable low carbon impact for their services and operations because of the service model they use will provide significant benefits for the organization. And then finally, we'll also be supported by new regulations that will come through. I've mentioned about 14001 and the UKSOS. We're also expecting the energy performance certificate regime to be updated later on this year. That's going to set out new standards for the minimum energy efficiency requirements for commercial buildings, taking us towards 2030. So that will in itself also lead on to a change in how buildings are going to be evaluated and the performance of them also documented. Next slide, please. So looking at well-being, and again, the three areas here. So we're currently in a stage where we're coming towards the peak of the inflated expectations. An awful lot of talk about well-being that's taken place, about benefits that are starting to come through as a result of that, and a lot of tools and systems and processes that helps organizations to implement it as well. And a lot of these are theoretical, but also well-intentioned. But it does lead us inherently towards, by 2030, coming down that trough of disillusionment. So what does that look like for 2030 and into that new section? So KPIs will become much more standardized. We have lots of different ways of how we assess and understand the subject area, but we haven't yet got some robust KPIs where we have an understanding of what the implications are, but also how they move the needle for the organization as well. What we are looking at is that there will be that shift towards mental health outcomes as the key performance indicator and the measure of success that we have. Secondly, technology will be used and the ability of being able to understand changes within workplace activities. We've seen significant increases in ventilation standards and ventilation rates, but we still don't fully understand what the linkages are that exist between some of the internal environments that we're putting forward and also some of those indicators that we want to be measuring. And then finally, the way that we implement sustainable design treatments into workplace designs, into changes within the setup of operational activities, will also start to become more normalized, and we'll start to see a better understanding of workplace integration and sustainability into that workplace standards, and the way that they're deployed, measured, and success is then evaluated off the back of it as well. So lots of these elements here are about developing on from early stage activities. There will be lots of mistakes that are going to be made, but we're also expecting to see an awful lot of information coming out about lessons learned and the direction of travel that's starting to come through. Next slide, please. And so looking at a subject area which has gone through that cycle as well. So the social impact area itself, currently it's on its downward trends from the peak. And we're seeing in general a lack of trust with data that is starting to be produced by organizations. We have organizations that are reporting social impact and social value figures that they're using that is equivalent of turnover of their own business as well. And that does raise questions in terms of the validity of the information as well. And if it's raising questions of the validity, it's also raising questions, therefore, in terms of the trust that's associated with those numbers and what they actually mean. So we will be moving towards much more harmonized approach in the various methodologies that are out there. We do need to rebuild trust in the numbers, which we're documenting and which we're putting forwards. And so that when we are putting forwards the value, the social value, the benefits which start to take place, the real life changes that are happening, then they're also going to be accepted and we can communicate them towards senior management. And so a key part of this moving towards 2030 is how do we take these numbers and include them as part of the financial accounts? This is the non-financial reporting, but it should form part and parcel of the financial accounts, the ARAs that are produced by organizations. Therefore, how do we get the trust in the numbers to allow them to go into those financial reports? Next slide, please. And the final area that we're looking at is risks and opportunities. And one thing which we understood fairly early on is that we were originally considering risks and opportunities to be together, but actually both of them are going at separate speeds. So the top graph shows the risks, and we're much, much further behind on understanding the risks than we are in the opportunities, which is much further ahead. And again, from behaviors, you would expect focus to be on the opportunities. We want to look ahead. We want to meet our growth targets. We want to be able to deliver more, and therefore inherently we do look at those opportunities. But it's the risk items that are going to be the most critical areas. If we fail to understand the risk items, those are the areas that can have a significant impact upon the balance sheet, upon the viability of organizations to be able to deliver and to grow as well. And so one of our challenges here is about how do we ensure that those risk elements are better understood and that they are also put in place more proactively. So that does require a change in culture that we're seeing across many senior management teams to want to talk about these risks and to understand them, the implications on their business, not just on a short-term basis, 12-month, 18-month, 2-year timelines, but also looking ahead at some strategic decisions makings that might be taking place over 3 to 5 years. And so this is talking much more about transition risks for businesses rather than just the direct physical risks, and the way that you adapt and you change your business as part of the landscape shifts, which also started to come through. AI will become a key part of this. We know that there's also a significant change and a reduction in some of the human-centric roles as well. And all of that adds on to both the risk elements, but also how do we navigate our way through that perspective as well. Okay, so that was a quick run through. We've got the link there for the report, so please do download it. What we want the report to be used for is to generate some thoughts around what that means for the sector, but also what does that mean in terms of the services that you offer? What does that mean in terms of the way that you communicate information currently? And also, how does this become more mainstreamed as part of day-to-day business and day-to-day activities? Next slide, please. Okay, so that's enough talking, I think, from Sophie and myself as well. We've run through the program for this year. If anyone does have any questions, if you want to put them into the Q&A or the chat function, we'll be happy to answer those questions. Yeah. Okay. So, Sophie, are you aware if there's any questions that have come through?
Yep, there are a few. Okay. So the first question is, with the rebranding of ESG reference from example decarbonisation to energy resilience, are we at risk of losing topics of concern, e.g. energy poverty? What do you think is at risk?
Yeah. So really good question, that one. And I think there are some key areas of concern which the FM sector has been responsible for. So things like energy poverty or living wage and those sorts of areas as well. And I think what we're looking at is a broader scale approach. So there are lots of challenges that we do have around the general cost of living and the impacts that we do have that comes out from that. The focus and the role of areas such as the carbon around the social impacts, I think we need to look at both areas. So we do need to understand what does it mean to be able to get towards the targets that we have, decarbonisation, the impacts and influences around social impacts, but how do we do that in a just manner? So it's that just transition approach that we're talking about here as well. And so certainly from the assessment perspectives that we do take with organisations, it is that just transition approach that we're talking about. How do organisations understand their stakeholders? Who's going to be affected by some of their decisions? And then how do they manage against the communication with those stakeholders, but also monitoring and looking at what those impacts and those implications would be. So for organisations, there's a key part here about the general workforce, the employees they have, and an understanding about how the cost of living is affecting them, because that will have a direct impact upon the uptake of these sustainability initiatives by the business as a whole.
Thanks, Neil. And then we have another question. So with the global nature of the context of ESG, is there any plan for the SFMI to review global FM best practice to perhaps help SFMI partners become best in class internationally?
Yeah. Again, another very good question. I think one of the areas that has been recognised is the UK is seen as being a leader in the wider FM sector overall. So not necessarily in the sustainability implementation delivery, but in the wider FM activities. And we see that again, time and time again, when we look at, say, the global FM programs and projects. It is very much led from a UK understanding of the service models and the way that FM is provided and delivered. So I think there's a joint element in here. There's one part of it which is looking at what does it look like in terms of the FM service model and how does that get adopted and how does that get rolled out. And then there's a second part of it which is looking at sustainability and its incorporation. And from a global perspective, that does vary and change. Sustainability as a subject area is very different when we start to talk about it from Southeast Asia. So whether that's a Vietnam or a Cambodia, that has a very, very different perception of the subject of sustainability than the areas that we talk about from a UK, Germany, and France perspective as well. So one thing which the SFMI does do, and the online assessment has allowed us to do in a bit more detail, is we can reframe the way that we perform the assessments and the focus that we put upon the requirements. So the assessment itself is very much outcome based. We want to understand from an organization, how do you meet up with these requirements within the context and the constraints of the operations for your business and also the cultures from the areas that you're operating and working within. So that does give us that flexibility and latitude to be able to assess different approaches whilst having a single assessment framework as well. One of the areas which the online assessment has allowed us to do, and there is a conversation that we've got with a European country to develop it very specifically for the key requirements within the country. We can adapt and change the online assessment to be very much tailored towards in-country operations as well. So that does allow us then to document and to capture more explicitly what those requirements would be at that local level for the online assessment. Yeah.
Thank you. Then we have one more question. Does the SFMI have a position on which of the social impact methodologies will form the foundation of the future harmonized approach it predicts?
So we're going to remain agnostic on that. I think there are a number of different tools and assessments that are out there. I think part of what we're trying to do is to connect the different ways of how we understand social impacts. There are some new ways of how it's developed, particularly across Europe as well. Netherlands have been quite strong in talking about social impact as an activity in this area. But it's also being able to connect that out to some of the ways that we measure social impact at a government level. So the Office of National Data produces information on what we mean by social impact on a regular basis. How do we get a better connectivity between those points of data sets that we have so we can see from an outcome perspective what activities we're performing and how do we start to make that shift in the way that it's then measured at a country level and also at a local and regional level as well. So what we're taking is, as a whole, we want to try and drive the sector to become more cooperative, to work more collaboratively together, but also start to understand how that data can be used in a way that allows us to communicate it in line with some of the UK national information or in-country national information that we have as well. And ultimately, that should allow us that trust that allows it to also get entered into the financial reporting activities as well. There is a standard which is starting to be developed as well, which looks at human capital. And we'll provide a link out as well when we send the information out these slides out as well. That's at a developmental stage, but it's following along the same lines as the climate risk assessment methodologies. So that's one to look out for. Again, it's an outcome-based approach, but it does start talking about what do we define and mean by social impacts, human capital, and those risks and challenges associated with those areas. Yeah. Sophie, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
No, that's all good. I think you covered everything.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending the session. What we will do, we'll send the slides out and also a recording out to everyone who joined the event today. Thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.